Hello, I have something a little bit different for you this week. This is an excerpt from Suzanne Albary's excellent podcast on doing better research, which she kindly also videoed so that I could put short sections on here for you. In this excerpt, I'm talking about why I think indie researchers should be funded, also talking a bit about my PhD and about creativity in research.
Helen, thank you very much for joining me on the Do Better Research podcast. It's great to have you here. I know I've been kind of stalking you and talking to you a lot over Twitter and social media for a number of years now. So it's great to finally kind of have you and speak to you in person. I wonder if you would introduce yourself a little bit, because you've got a really interesting academic career background that's not in traditional higher education.
This is true, I do. I've never been an academic, and I have no aspirations to be an academic, as in employed by a university, but I've learned to speak the language. I've been an independent researcher for 22 years now. And to begin with, I was working for local government, central government, third sector organisations. And I did a master's degree to improve my research skills. My first degree was research based, but it'd been quite a lot of time before. Having done a master's, I thought I'd like to go on and do a PhD, so I did that. And that meant that when the recession hit, after the change of government in 2010, I was able to reinvent myself as an independent scholar. And I wrote the research methods book I'd always wanted to write, and everything snowballed from there, really.
So that leads us really nicely into a question that I ask all my guests on the podcast, which is, what is it you enjoy about doing research?
That's a really good question. I think I enjoy the way that the work is kind of often chunked up. I can spend quite a lot of time on one task most days, and I like that way of working. It's not particularly bitty. I like being able to get stuck into reviewing some literature or a bunch of telephone interviews or online interviews, or spend all day coding data very happily, or writing a research report or another research output. So I like that aspect of it, but also I like finding out about stuff. I think being paid to be nosy is a terrific way to make a living. And the fact that I get to talk to people about things that in normal life I never would get to talk to those people, have those conversations, and find out stuff and just ask, really. I'm not really talking about deeply personal questions because I work much more in professional arenas, but being able to ask people about their work and why they do it and how they do it and all sorts of interesting things. And I love the variety too. As an independent researcher, I get such a lot of variety. I mean, last week I was doing research on community radio, older people's radio shows on community radio. This week I was doing a load of research around co-production and disability. It's very, very varied, and I really like that.
So my next question might be a tough one then, considering you've done so many very different research projects. But I wonder if you might want to, or might be able to outline your favourite research project to date and why that has been.
In a lot of ways, I think it was my doctoral research because it was my project. As a contract researcher, I'm working to the requirements of research funders, research commissioners, research managers, people who contract out work to me to do. And I'm lucky that I'm interested in the things they're interested in, and that I'm interested in most of the work I do. But my doctoral research was a project that was really fully mine from the outset to the end. I'd love to do another project that's fully mine, but I don't think it's ever going to happen because as an independent researcher, I have no access to research funding, which is deeply frustrating. I think actually the research funders in the UK are missing a trick there because there are an increasing number of independent researchers. And when you're independent, you don't need a lot of funding to do something really worthwhile. And you don't have to spend much of it on overheads. I've been involved with some university funding bids, and I have been horrified by universities, the institution, taking 40 or 50% of the funding for overheads. Of course, they should have some percentage for overheads. They've got to run the buildings and heat them and light them and all of that stuff. but it seems a very disproportionate amount. I think they're ripping off research funders, and research funders working with independent researchers could help to redress that. I've actually asked the chief executive of the Economics and Social Research Council why they don't work with independent researchers, and her answer at the time, it was Jane Elliott, not the current incumbent, and she said, "Well, we're not geared up for funding single people, individuals." And I said, "So go talk to the Arts Council. They do it all the time. They'll tell you what to do." But that didn't seem to be to hold any water. So I find it intensely frustrating. But I would love to do the project. I would love to do if I could get funding. I would love to sit with people doing data analysis and get them to think aloud and record that and analyze it all about qualitative data analysis, really figure out how people do it in practice, because that's something that I think hasn't been studied. I would love to do that, but I don't think I'll ever.
So going back to your PhD, what was your PhD on?
My PhD was on the emotion work of Sure Start program managers. Sure Start was a New Labour area-based initiative to support families with children under 5 in particular areas of deprivation. And it later became known as children's centres. And the people who were the managers of these projects, they were very well funded. There was often a building, a capital project. So a building was created, and then a multidisciplinary team with midwives and nursery nurses and educators and music therapists, all sorts of people, crash workers, lots of people. And then there was the program manager, and then there was the board. At Sure Start, there was always a board running these things collectively, and then local government, and then national government. So the program manager was sort of at the centre of the hourglass on their own, with this massive number of people above them and this massive number of people below them, and everything funneling through that one individual. So their emotion work was the emotional labour they had to undertake was fairly phenomenal. And they didn't get a massive amount of support in some cases. So they might be dealing with a family where the children are on the at-risk register. They might be dealing with a staff member who's just had a bereavement. They might be doing, just huge amounts of emotional impact. And I used storytelling. I kind of devised a new research method, and I feel deeply ashamed that I've never written it up for a journal. I keep thinking one day I'll get around to that. But I called it the multi-story method. And I got them to tell me, I got them in small groups of 4. And I got each person to tell a story, a fictionalized story. And they could base it on a soap opera or a fairy tale or an advert or whatever they liked, pantomime, anything, about how it felt to be a Sure Start program manager. And the stories were terrific. And then after each story was told, the group discussed the story in the story's own terms. So there was no sort of, oh, well, you're obviously the prince in that one. It was more like, oh, well, the prince was having a hard time, wasn't he? What do you think he could have done differently? And the discussions were fascinating. And I had to keep quiet through all of this, but I was recording and it was great. And then at the very end, we had a little discussion of the process and a sort of evaluative discussion where I did get to join in and ask them questions about how the process had been. They all loved it. Then we had a nice lunch. It was great. I did three of those sessions, and that was my data. And then I wrote about it, and I love writing, so the writing was fine. My examiner said it was the best written doctoral thesis he'd ever seen, and I remain intensely proud of it.
That sounds like a really interesting story in and of itself. Thinking about stories, and I just want to ask you something about the doing of that research, because particularly other researchers that I've spoken to who have used creative methods, some of their participants have been a little hesitant or reticent or dismissive of engaging with particularly quite creative and different research methods. They're used to the really traditional interview, focus group, questionnaire. But as soon as you get them to ask them to do something a little bit different, they can be quite hesitant, if not, obstructive. What's the point? It doesn't make any sense. How did you come up across any of those problems with your participants, or how did they react to the process?
Well, it was probably easier because I kind of knew them anyway from our professional contacts that we'd had, because I did a lot of professional work with Sure Start programs. That was what got me interested in this particular topic. But also, they were all at heart early years practitioners although they were by now managers, they'd all come up through as early years practitioners in some shape or form, whether in schools or in other contexts. And early years practitioners like play and they like stories and they like all those things. So they were very open to it, very open to it. And also they were a pretty creative bunch, really. And again, I think there's often a bit of misapprehension. We silo people. This is quite a new thing in terms of the length of human history, but we silo people. If they're a manager, we tend to see them as that's all they are, but that's not all they are. One of them was a talented painter. Another was very good at textile arts. They all had huge amounts of creativity, often goes unrecognized. I think everyone does, really. I actually think everyone's creative. And with creative methods, I think it's important to have an alternative, because some people are really uncomfortable, and we're not in this business to make our participants uncomfortable. And also, some people can't engage in some creative pursuits, like if it's textile arts, but you've got someone with arthritis in their hands, they probably may not be able to join in with that. Some forms of dyslexia make poetry really difficult. This kind of thing, we need to be aware of this. So I think having a plan B is a good idea. But I don't subscribe to the I'm not creative theory that some people hold. And I will talk to people who claim that they're not creative, and I will explain that they are indeed very creative, and that evidence of this is that they have relationships with other people, which is always a creative act. We co-create our relationships with other people in every interaction that we have with them throughout the duration of that relationship. And once they get their head around that concept, they start cheering up. And then I explain that they can't possibly get it wrong, and that cheers them up as well. And generally, I find people are very willing to join in. I remember doing a keynote speech for a group of pretty predominantly quant doctoral researchers, and they'd asked me to come and keynote on creative methods. And one thing I like to do in keynotes, because it's quite a long time to listen to someone talk, even someone as fabulous as me. So I got them to they all had coloured pipe cleaners in their conference packs, probably 4 long different coloured pipe cleaners. And I got them to make models with their pipe cleaners. And they all really got into it. I can't remember what I gave them. I think it said model about your research. I think I did in that one. And they all got really into it. And there was such a buzz in the room. And they all loved it. And I'd asked them previously who thinks they're creative, and only a few hands had gone up. But this modelling went so well. And then I said, now who thinks they're creative? Look, you've all made lovely models. It's great. And they were like, oh, yeah, I suppose. So I think it's a misconception. I think people have this misconception that they're not creative. And I think we can talk them out of it.
Next week, in part 2, I'll be talking about writing as a research method and the importance of accessible communication. If you can't wait till then, you can check out this podcast and other podcasts from Suzanne on doing better research. The link is below.